Hey everyone, it's Pastor Stephanie here. If you're watching this during worship, you might notice something a little bit different, which is that I'm not actually there. I'm off this week because I'm going to be attending a conference, and I'm actually going to be doing this like you all are doing with your own school from my computer at home. Except I'm also going to be learning with people all across the country who are at their computers in their homes. It's good for me to have this time off so that I can focus on the material that I need to learn and the reading that I need to do in advance, but I also miss being with you all. I am glad, though, that I get to be with you today to share some stories about King David. King David was the most important king in Israel's history, and so there are a lot of stories about him in the Bible that I encourage you to read. But let's take a look back at some of what we saw and heard last week first. On the left-hand side, you'll see a picture of Samuel when he was just a boy living in the temple, and he heard God calling to him in the middle of the night. Well, Samuel grew up in the temple, and he became a very important religious and political leader for the people, and he is the last judge of Israel who anointed the very first kings of Israel. So first he anointed King Saul, and then in the picture on the right, we see him anointing the new king of Israel, King David. When he met King David, David was just a shepherd boy living at home, and that's why you see the sheep around him. Nobody expected that he was ever going to be the king of Israel, or probably much of anything at all. But David did some pretty special things. There are lots of Bible stories about David, and I would encourage you to read some of them with your family. This picture that is on the left-hand side is from one of those stories, and it's about David fighting the giant Goliath. To make a long story short, David won, and that was really just the start of David doing amazing things because he was following what God told him to do. David was a good leader, but he definitely was not perfect. In fact, there's one story, and you can read it with your parents. It's the story of David and Bathsheba. And it's a story about David taking something from somebody else because he wanted it. I'll be honest, it's a really disturbing story, and it really shows us that David was definitely not perfect. But like I said, he was a good leader, and he was a follower of God. So one day he decided that he wanted to build God a really big, impressive house, or a temple. All of this time, as the people of Israel had been wandering through the desert and then had come into their own land and had been building the kingdom of Israel, they had done all of their worship in the tabernacle, which was a tent that they could move from place to place. David decided that he was going to do something about that. He thought that if he lived in an amazing house, that God should surely have an even more amazing house. And so he decided that he was going to build a big temple that would be a place where people could come and worship God. It seemed like a really good plan at first, but God spoke through the prophet Nathan, who you see in this page. And God told Nathan to tell David that he was not the one who was going to build this temple, because of the things that he had done. Now imagine that you are the prophet Nathan, and you are told that you need to go and tell the powerful king that God doesn't want him to do the thing that he wants to do, and that it's because of something bad that the king himself did. Kings aren't used to having people tell them when they've done something wrong, and so Nathan came up with a good idea. He told David a story about a rich person who had everything that he wanted and needed, but who still did something very wrong by stealing what belonged to his neighbor. David was furious. He said that was awful behavior, and he was right. And he thought that that person should be punished, and he was right. But then Nathan told David that he was that person, and that because of what he had done with Bathsheba, God didn't want David to build this temple, but that the temple would be built by his son Solomon. Can you imagine having all that David had and still wanting more? As we heard, David was a very powerful king, but he abused that power to get what he wanted, even when it hurt other people. The prophet Nathan had to have courage to confront David with what he did. Is there a time you can think of that you've had to have courage to do the right thing? Why was building a temple so important to David? I wonder if we can understand some of why that is because of the virus today, when we're not able to worship together in our beautiful sanctuary. These are some questions you can think about and talk about with your parents this week. And if you ever have any questions, I am more than happy to set up a time to talk with you over Zoom. I hope you all have a really good week, and I look forward to being back with you next Sunday.